The first frost of November 1887 clung to the fields outside of Harrows Creek, Kentucky, like a thin layer of white lace. The air was brittle, sharp enough to sting the lungs, and the wind carried the smell of damp earth and the faint sweetness of rotting apples from the orchards. This was a town that did not change quickly, a place where each year's harvest mirrored the last, where neighbors could trace family lines back to the Revolutionary War, and where life moved in steady, predictable patterns. Or at least, it had, until that morning the news traveled faster than the cold. By sunrise, whispers were already spilling out of the general store and snaking through the small cluster of houses. Along Main Street, a body had been found in the Morton barn. People used the word murder without hesitation, though no one yet had proof. What they did have was a name, and in Harrows Creek, a name was enough to set the air buzzing. Her name was Clara Ridgeway. Clara was 21, a farmhand's daughter, with pale blue eyes that always seemed fixed on something distant. She lived with her widowed mother in a weather-worn farmhouse on the outskirts of town. Those who knew her spoke of her in hushed tones, not because she was a troublemaker. Clara was quiet, almost unnervingly so, but because there was a certain strangeness about her. She had a way of slipping into a room without being noticed, of standing still in such a way that people sometimes forgot she was there. It wasn't shyness exactly, but something else, something harder to name. The discovery was made by Jacob Morton, who had gone out before dawn to feed the horses. The barn door was ajar, swinging lightly in the wind. Inside, the lantern light caught on something pale near the back wall. At first, Jacob thought it was a sack of grain left open to the cold, but when he drew closer, he saw a face, Clara's face. Her skin was waxen, her lips parted slightly, and her dress was torn across. The bodice. The hay beneath her was dark and stiff where it had soaked in blood by the time the sheriff arrived. The barn was crowded with onlookers. People stood just far enough back to keep from stepping in the blood, but close enough to see the deep gash that cut across her throat. There was no question she was dead. Her skin had already taken on that pale, bluish tone that spoke of hours without life. The coroner, a man named Pritchard, arrived mid-morning. He was a thin, stooped figure with eyes that seemed too large for his head. He examined her with an unsettling calm, as if turning over a broken object. His verdict was quick and definitive. Clara Ridgeway had been murdered sometime in the night. Her life ended by a single, precise slash. The wound was clean, professional even. Her body was taken to the small undertaker's parlor on Sycamore Street, where it would be prepared for burial. In towns like Harrows Creek, the funeral process moved swiftly, partly due to custom, and partly due to necessity, as the cold could only hold decay at bay for so long. Mrs. Ridgeway, when she was told, did not scream or weep. Instead, she sat very still, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that the knuckles turned white. Some thought her silence was shock. Others whispered that she had always been an odd woman herself. By evening, the story had grown. Some said Clara had been meeting someone in secret at the Morton barn, perhaps a lover her mother didn't approve of. Others claimed she had been carrying a letter when she died, one that had vanished before the sheriff could secure the scene. A few insisted they had seen strange lights near the barn the night before, but those stories always came from the same kinds of people, the ones who liked to mix gossip with superstition. The next day, preparations were made for the funeral. A coffin was ordered from Lexington, a kind lined with cream-colored satin. The undertaker, Mr. Hall, worked methodically, cleaning and arranging the body, covering the wound as best he could. Those who saw her in the parlor said she looked almost peaceful, though there was something unsettling about the way her eyes seemed just barely open, as if she were watching the people who came to stand over her. The funeral was set for 2 days. After the discovery, Harrows Creek was not a large town. but nearly everyone planned to attend. Funerals here were not only moments of grief, but also gatherings where the living took stock of one another. Who had aged? Who had changed? Who was missing? In Clara's case, there was another reason people wanted to see her laid to rest. Her murder was the first in over 2 decades, and no one could imagine such a thing happening without a reason. That morning, the church bells rang slow and heavy, their sound rolling over the frost-covered hills. Inside the small wooden chapel, Clara's coffin rested at the front, draped with white lily. The air was thick with the smell of beeswax and flowers, a sweetness that seemed almost cloying in the close space. Mrs. Ridgeway sat in the front pew, her face unreadable. The service began as expected. The minister spoke of life and death, of the mysteries of God's will, of the promise of eternal rest. People listened with bowed heads, murmuring prayers. It was during the final hymn, just as the pallbearers began to move toward the coffin, that something happened which would be spoken of in Harrows Creek for generations. That it began with a sound faint, almost lost beneath the organ music. A soft, rasping noise, like someone struggling to breathe. At first, people thought it was one of the elderly congregants, overcome with emotion. But then the coffin shifted. Not much, just enough for the lid to creak against its hinges. Gasps filled the chapel. The pallbearers froze. The minister's voice faltered. And then, before anyone could move, the coffin lid pushed open from the inside. Clara Ridgeway sat up. Her face was pale, her hair tangled, her lips dry and cracked. Her eyes, those pale blue eyes, scanned the room slowly, as if trying to recognize the faces before her. She said nothing. She made no sound beyond the ragged pull of breath. For a long, frozen moment, no one moved. Then the screams began. Some fled the chapel. Others crossed themselves and dropped to their knees. Mrs. Ridgeway did not move at all, but a faint, almost imperceptible smile curved the corners of her mouth. Clara climbed out of the coffin, her movements slow but steady. She stood at the front of the church, looking at the crowd as though she were seeing them from a great distance. There was no joy, no confusion, no fear in her face. Only a strange, unreadable calm. The sheriff stepped forward, reaching out as if to steady her. But when he asked her what had happened, where she had been, how she was standing there alive, Clara only tilted her head slightly, as though the words were foreign to her. And then, in a voice no louder than a whisper, she said, "I don't remember dying." But there was something in her eyes, a glimmer, quick and sharp, that suggested she might remember far more than she was willing to tell. And in that instant, everyone in Harrows Creek understood something they could not explain. Whatever had returned from the grave that morning was not quite the same Clara Ridgeway they had known. The shock of Clara Ridgeway's return rippled through Harrows Creek like a storm wind, leaving the townspeople unsettled, whispering in corners and watching their neighbors with new suspicion. It wasn't simply that she had come back. It was how she had done it. People could accept miracles if they were framed in the right language, blessed by the church and wrapped in talk of divine will. But Clara's return had not felt holy. It had felt wrong, like something that slipped past the natural order when no one was looking. The sheriff tried to take control of the situation, leading Clara from the chapel under the eyes of the entire congregation. She walked without assistance, though her steps were deliberate, almost measured. There was none of the clumsiness one might expect from someone believed dead for days. Her skin, though pale, no longer held the icy stiffness that Pritchard, the coroner, had sworn was proof of death. She looked alive, utterly, unnervingly alive. Mrs. Ridgeway followed, her black dress trailing over the worn wooden floor. She didn't look at anyone, didn't respond to the questions thrown at her in hurried whispers. Her eyes never left Clara's back, as if making sure her daughter wouldn't slip away again. The sheriff escorted them to the Ridgeway farmhouse, where the wind rattled the bare branches against the roof like skeletal fingers. A few townsfolk followed at a distance, unwilling to let Clara out of their sight. They had seen something impossible, and impossible things did not happen without consequence. By the next morning, the story had spread far beyond Harrows Creek. People from neighboring towns began arriving, some out of curiosity, others to see if they could catch a glimpse of the girl who had risen from her own coffin. The minister struggled to find words that would comfort the frightened. He preached that the Lord's ways were mysterious, but even he could not meet Clara's gaze for long. Coroner Pritchard, however, was not comforted by faith. He was a man who believed in the certainty of death, and he had examined Clara with his own hands. He had noted the absence of a pulse, the cooling of her skin, the rigidity in her limbs. He had signed her death certificate himself, and yet she had walked away from her own funeral. 2 days after her return, he went to the Ridgeway home to examine her again. Mrs. Ridgeway allowed him in, though reluctantly. Clara sat by the window, looking out at the bare orchard. She didn't turn when Pritchard entered. Up close, he noticed odd details. Her fingernails were rimmed with faint dirt, the kind that suggested she had been digging or clawing at something. There was also a thin, dark line around her neck, just above the place where her throat had been cut, a mark that was neither stitch nor scar, but something in between. Her eyes, pale as frost, seemed more distant now, and there was an unnerving stillness about her, as though her breathing were too quiet, too slow. Pritchard asked her questions. Each one met with the same soft reply, "I don't remember." When he pressed, she added only, "I was cold, and then I wasn't." He tried to examine the wound on her neck, but Clara turned her head away, ending the conversation. That evening, he confided in the sheriff. "She was dead," Pritchard insisted. "I would stake my reputation on it. But whatever she is now, I'm not certain she's the same as before." The sheriff didn't like the implication. The murder investigation had already hit a dead end. No weapon found, no witnesses, no clear motive. And now the victim was alive, which made the case not just complicated, but impossible to classify. The townsfolk were no longer talking about catching a killer. They were wondering what Clara had brought back with her Dot in the days that followed. Strange reports began to circulate. One neighbor claimed they had seen Clara walking the orchard at midnight, barefoot in the frost. Another swore they had passed her on the road to town in the early morning, only to see her again, moments later, standing in her yard as if she had never moved. A group of children whispered that they had seen her staring into the creek for hours without blinking. Mrs. Ridgeway dismissed these stories, saying her daughter was simply recovering, and people were letting their imaginations run wild. But even she began keeping the curtains drawn at night, and the kitchen lamps burning until dawn. On the 6th night after the funeral, a heavy snow fell. By morning, the whole town was wrapped in white, the silence thick and heavy. It was then that the first sign appeared that something far darker might be unfolding. The Morton barn, the place where Clara's body had been found, was discovered with its doors wide open, despite being locked the evening before. Inside, the hay was disturbed, as though something had been dragged across it. In the far corner, where Clara's body had once lain, there was now only a deep impression in the hay and a scattering of frost, as if the cold itself had pooled. Their Dot, and on the wall, carved deep into the wood with something sharp, were 3 words, "I was here." The sheriff showed the markings to Pritchard, who frowned deeply. The letters were uneven but deliberate, and the wood shavings on the floor were fresh. Whoever had carved them had done so within the night. When asked if she had gone to the barn, Clara only said, "I don't remember," but her eyes flicked, just for a moment, toward the frost-rimmed windows. as though she were listening to something far away. No one in Harrows Creek knew it yet, but the girl who had returned was about to lead them into something far more dangerous than a murder investigation. By the second week after Clara Ridgeway's return, the initial wave of shock had settled into something far heavier, a tense, unspoken fear that seemed to hang over Harrows Creek like a winter fog. The town had seen death before. They had even seen tragedy in the form of sudden accidents, illness, and storms. But this was different. This was a wound that had not healed, because no one could decide if it had truly closed at all. Clara's presence became a strange kind of spectacle. Strangers from surrounding counties came under the pretense of visiting relatives, only to linger near the Ridgeway property, hoping for a glimpse. Some came with questions, others with offerings, small crosses, pressed flowers, bottles of holy water. Not all were there in kindness. A few simply wanted proof that the rumors were true, that a dead girl now walked the living earth again. The Ridgeway farmhouse itself seemed changed. The white paint was more weathered than people remembered, and the porch boards creaked with a hollow sound, as though the house had aged decades in a matter of days. At night, a dim light burned in the upstairs window, Clara's room, but no one ever saw her draw the curtains aside. The sheriff tried to keep order, but order was a fragile thing in Harrows Creek now. His own deputies spoke of unease. One admitted that when he delivered firewood to the Ridgeways, he had found Clara sitting in the corner of the parlor, facing the wall. She hadn't moved or acknowledged him until he'd left the bundle and turned to go. Only then had she whispered something under her breath, a word he couldn't quite catch, though it had sounded like a name. Coroner Pritchard, increasingly unable to leave the matter alone, began keeping a private journal of every unusual detail surrounding Clara's case. In the week following her return, he noted, skin temperature consistently cooler than normal, even beside the stove. Pupils slow to respond to light. Breathing unnervingly shallow during sleep, to the point he suspected she might stop altogether. A faint odor clinging to her, not of decay, but of damp earth. There was something else, too. Something he didn't write down immediately for fear of seeming irrational. The cut across her throat, which should have healed into a visible scar, seemed to fade by the day. On his first visit, it was still angry and raw. By his third, it was nothing but a faint shadow beneath the skin. On the 10th day, a new event jarred the already frayed nerves of the town. It began when a farmer named Amos Weller failed to return from checking his livestock in the early morning. His son went searching and found him standing in the far corner of their pasture, pale as frost, staring toward the tree line. When asked what had happened, Amos said nothing, but the boy swore his father's coat was dusted with snow, despite there being none on the ground. That evening, Amos came to the sheriff's office, trembling as he told his story in full. He claimed he had seen Clara at the edge of the woods, her bare feet pressed into the frozen ground. She had been watching him in complete silence, her pale dress stirring in a wind he couldn't feel. When he called out, she turned and walked into the trees, not hurriedly, but with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who knew they were being followed. Amos, compelled without understanding why, had gone after her. He had followed her, deeper and deeper into the woods, until the air grew unnaturally still. Then, without warning, she was gone. The only thing in her place was a patch of ground where the snow clung thicker than anywhere else, shaped almost like a human outline. The sheriff wanted to dismiss the account as nerves, but Amos was no storyteller. His hands shook as he spoke, and his eyes held the wild, hollow look of someone who had seen something they could not explain away. Pritchard, hearing of this, felt a cold weight in his stomach. He decided he needed one final examination, not for the sake of medicine, but for his own sanity. He visited the Ridgeways that night, bringing with him a small lamp and a resolve to confront Clara directly. Mrs. Ridgeway met him at the door, her expression unreadable. "She's resting," she said, but made no move to stop him. Upstairs, Clara's room smelled faintly of candle wax and something metallic. She was lying on her bed, her eyes open in the dim light. Pritchard stepped closer, holding the lamp low. "Do you remember the barn?" he asked softly. "Do you remember who put you there?" Clara's gaze shifted to him, slow and deliberate. For a long time, she said nothing. Then her lips parted slightly, and she spoke, but the sound that came out was not a single word. It was a string of syllables, low and uneven, in a language Pritchard did not know. He felt the hair rise on his arms. The cadence was strange, rhythmic, like a chant. He wanted to ask her to repeat it, but something in him, something primal, told him not to. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of something in the corner of the room, a pair of Clara's boots, their soles caked in frozen mud. The pattern was unusual, almost like the imprints of small, crooked hands pressed into the earth. Pritchard left quickly, telling himself he would not return. Yet even as he walked home through the cold night, he could feel the rhythm of Clara's strange words still moving through his mind, as if they had left an imprint of their own. The following morning, Harrows Creek would wake to another discovery, one that would make whispers about a murder seem almost harmless by comparison. The first sign of trouble came with the church bells. They rang at an hour when they shouldn't have, not for Sunday service, not for a wedding, not for a funeral. The sound was thin and hurried, more like an alarm than a call to gather. By the time most of Harrows Creek had stepped out into the brittle morning air, the bells had already stopped, leaving behind an uneasy stillness. It was the minister's wife, Mrs. Calloway, who brought the news. Her face was pale, her hair still, wrapped in a sleep cap as she hurried down Main Street, speaking in a rush to anyone who would listen. She had gone to the chapel to prepare the altar for the day's prayer service, and found the front doors wide open. At first, she thought vandals had broken in, but when she stepped inside, she saw it. The coffin. It was the same coffin Clara Ridgeway had been buried in, or rather, was supposed to be buried in, the one she had risen from 11 days earlier. It had been taken from the undertaker's storage, without anyone noticing, and placed in the exact spot it had occupied during her funeral. But it wasn't empty. Inside was something wrapped in rough burlap, tied with fraying rope. When the minister arrived and cut the bindings, the burlap peeled away to reveal what looked like a figure made of straw and cloth scraps, crudely shaped into a human form. At the throat was a slash of red pigment, or maybe dried blood, and on its face, stitched in black thread, were 2 pale blue buttons for eyes. Someone or something had made an effigy of Clara and placed it in the coffin she had escaped. The sheriff was summoned at once, along with Pritchard, who examined the figure with a mix of fascination and dread. It was primitive but deliberate, the kind of thing one might expect in some old, half-forgotten ritual. The straw smelled faintly of damp soil, and when Pritchard pulled at one of the stitches, he found something woven into the chest cavity. A lock of real human hair, light brown, matching Clara's exactly. That discovery broke whatever composure the minister had been trying to keep. He insisted the effigy be burned immediately, claiming it was a blasphemy, perhaps even a curse. But the sheriff stopped him. This was evidence. Evidence of what, he couldn't yet say, but something in his gut told him destroying it would only bury the truth deeper. Word spread fast. By mid-afternoon, people were already whispering about witchcraft, curses, and old mountain superstitions. Some claimed the effigy meant Clara's soul was still in danger, that she had only returned in body, not in spirit. Others muttered that it was a warning, a message from whoever had killed her in the first place. That night, the Ridgeway farmhouse became the center of attention. Townsfolk gathered at a distance, as if expecting Clara herself to emerge and explain the meaning of the effigy. But she did not come to the window, did not step outside. The only sign of life from the house was the faint flicker of lamplight, and occasionally the shadow of someone moving slowly through the upstairs rooms. Inside, Mrs. Ridgeway refused to speak of the coffin or the effigy. She kept Clara close, rarely letting her out of sight. When the sheriff tried to question Clara again, she only gave her now familiar answer, "I don't remember." Yet there was a new quality in her voice this time, a faint upward curl, almost like amusement. The snow began again that evening, falling in thick, slow flakes that muffled the sound of the town. By midnight, Harrows Creek lay under a white blanket, unbroken except for a set of tracks leading from the edge of the Ridgeway property into the orchard. They were barefoot tracks, too narrow and too deep for any man, spaced in a way that suggested. The walker had moved with a strange, deliberate rhythm. The sheriff, following them the next morning, traced the path through the orchard and into the woods. The tracks ended in a small clearing where the snow had melted away entirely, revealing a patch of black, sodden earth. In the center of the clearing was a small mound, no taller than a child's knee, covered in frost. When the sheriff brushed it aside with his boot, he found something buried just beneath the surface. Another effigy, identical to the one found in the coffin, but smaller. This one had no face, only a stitched X where the eyes should be. When Pritchard examined it, he found no hair inside, but the straw was damp and cold to the touch, as if it had been pulled from the earth just moments before. That evening, something strange happened at the Ridgeway home. According to the neighbor who lived across the frozen field, every lamp in the house went out at once. For several minutes, the house was completely dark. Then, one by one, the upstairs windows began to glow, not with lamplight, but with a cold bluish shimmer that seemed to move like water dot. It lasted less than a minute. But in that time, the neighbor swore she saw a figure standing in the orchard, watching the house. She said it looked like Clara, except the eyes were far too bright, and they were fixed directly on her. The sheriff dismissed the account as fear-driven fancy, but Pritchard wrote it down in his journal. He was starting to believe the townspeople's unease had a foundation. The effigies, the coffin, the tracks in the snow, they were all pieces of something larger, something that had begun the moment Clara returned from the grave, and in the days ahead, Harrows Creek would come to realize that the girl who had died once and returned might not be the only one caught between two worlds. The winter storm tightened its grip on Harrows Creek, swallowing the countryside in silence. Roads became impassable, the rail line to Louisville froze, and the town slipped into a kind of isolated limbo where the outside world felt unreal. Snow turned the familiar into the strange. Barns hunched like sleeping animals under their white coats. Fence posts became teeth in a buried jaw, and the woods stood still and listening. It was in this frozen quiet that the second incident occurred. 3 days after the effigy was found in the coffin, Sheriff McCall was woken by frantic pounding on his door. It was Joseph Weaver, a farmhand from the outskirts, his face pale with cold and something worse. Weaver had been out at dawn to check his traps when he stumbled upon what he called a grave that wasn't there yesterday. The sheriff followed him out to the site, a low hillock at the edge of the frozen marshland. There, just under a crust of snow, lay a long, narrow mound, no coffin, no marker. But it was not untouched. Someone had driven 13 wooden stakes into the ground along its length, each carved with strange, looping symbols. The snow around the mound was churned with footprints, small ones, barefoot, like the prints in the Ridgeway orchard. They circled the mound over and over, then trailed off toward the tree line. McCall ordered one of the stakes pulled up for inspection. Beneath the thin layer of frost, The wood was stained a deep reddish brown. Pritchard arrived an hour later and confirmed the worst. It was blood, though whether human or animal, he couldn't say. When the mound was opened, what lay beneath sent a shiver through even the most hard-nerved men present. It wasn't a body, but another effigy, this one far more elaborate than the others. The straw was mixed with dried river reeds, the limbs bound with sinew instead of rope. Around the neck was a necklace of teeth, some animal, some clearly human. And inside the chest cavity was a tightly folded scrap of linen bearing a name written in faded ink, Clara Ridgeway. The men covered it quickly, but not quickly enough for the gossip to spread. By that afternoon, the town was alive with whispers of witchcraft, curses, and a kind of magic older than the church. Some swore the stakes and symbols matched stories passed down from the earliest settlers, tales of the hollow sleepers, those who walked between life and death, their bodies inhabited by something else. In those stories, effigies were not memorials, but bindings, anchors meant to keep the sleeper's soul tethered, so it could not stray too far. Others took a more immediate view, that Clara had not truly returned as herself. It didn't help that. Clara's behavior was changing in ways that made even her mother uneasy. She seemed to wander at night, though the house was locked, and the snow outside remained undisturbed. More than once, Mrs. Ridgeway claimed she found Clara standing by the upstairs window in her nightdress, staring out toward the orchard floor. Hours, and there was something in her eyes now, a brightness that caught the light wrong, like glass instead of flesh. When she looked at you, it felt less like recognition and more like assessment, as if she were measuring the distance between you and something she could see, but you could not. Then came the incident with the hound. Elias, Baker's mastiff, had been missing for 2 days when he found it lying dead just inside the Ridgeway orchard. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, but its eyes were gone, removed with surgical precision. When the sheriff came to ask questions, Mrs. Ridgeway insisted neither she nor Clara knew anything about it. Clara only stood in the doorway, silent, her expression unreadable. By now, a quiet split had formed in Harrows Creek. Some believed Clara needed protection, that whatever forces had taken her life once might be trying to claim it again. Others believed she was the source of the danger, that the only reason the effigies were appearing, the only reason strange things were happening, was because she had returned. In his notes, Pritchard described a new unease, the sense that the effigies were escalating. They were no longer just crude straw dolls. They were becoming more lifelike, more personal, each one carrying a piece of the real world inside it, hair, teeth, names. If this continued, he feared the next effigy might not be a representation at all, but something much closer to flesh. On the night of January 14th, the snow fell harder than it had all winter. By morning, the drifts were high enough to seal doors shut and bury half the town's wagons. Yet even in that depth of snow, tracks appeared again outside the Ridgeway home, the same barefoot prints, this time leading not into the orchard, but directly up to Clara's bedroom window. There were no prints leading away. That day, Clara did not come downstairs. Mrs. Ridgeway claimed she was unwell, but the doctor who came to check on her found the door to her room locked from the inside. Through the crack, he swore he could smell damp earth and hear the faint rustle of straw. Pritchard, now convinced the town was dealing with something that defied ordinary explanation, made a decision. He would visit the marsh mound again at first. Light, dig deeper, and see if there was anything beneath the effigy. He had a suspicion, one he could barely bring himself to write down, that the effigy was not the only thing buried there. He would not live long enough to confirm it. The morning of January 15th broke dim and leaden, the snow reflecting what little light the sun could manage. The storm had eased, but the cold had sharpened, so deep that each breath felt like a bite. It was under this steel-gray sky that Dr. Henry Pritchard set out toward the marsh mound. He left his lodgings just after dawn, wrapped in his heavy wool coat, a satchel of tools slung over his shoulder. Sheriff McCall had agreed to meet him there, though the sheriff was running late, delayed by a wagon axle frozen solid in his barn. Witnesses remembered seeing Pritchard walking alone along the ridge road, his dark figure half vanishing into the fog that clung low to the field's dot by midday. The doctor had not returned. McCall finally reached the marshland around noon, the snow crunching under his boots as he followed the familiar trail. The mound stood there as before, the 13 stakes in place, the wind hissing through the reeds. But there were fresh disturbances now, a set of footprints leading right up to it. Pritchard's footprints. They went both ways, toward the mound and back toward the road, but the return trail stopped abruptly halfway, as though the doctor had been lifted from the ground. From that point on, the snow was undisturbed. McCall approached the mound cautiously. One of the stakes had been pulled free and lay in the snow, the tip still stained with that brown-red crust. The effigy's chest had been cut open again, and the linen scrap with Clara's name was gone. When they found Pritchard, he was lying face up in the shallow ditch at the edge of the marsh, his coat unbuttoned, his gloves missing. His skin was pale as the snow, yet his eyes were wide open, the irises clouded to a milky white. Around his neck hung the very scrap of linen that had been inside the effigy, still bearing the name Clara Ridgeway, though the ink was now smudged as if by damp fingers. The coroner ruled the death as exposure, claiming Pritchard must have lost his way and succumbed to the cold. But those who had seen his body spoke differently. There were no signs of frostbite, no stiffness in his limbs. He looked more like a man who had drowned, though there was no water nearby, and his lungs held only air. That night, McCall visited the Ridgeway home under the pretense of delivering the doctor's belongings. Clara answered the door herself. She was pale, but not sickly. Her hair hung loose, and she was barefoot despite the freezing weather. The sheriff noticed something else, too, the faint imprint of a necklace around her neck, the skin slightly reddened, as though it had been worn tightly. When he asked about the doctor's death, Clara only tilted her head and said she didn't think he had been looking in the right place. Then she closed the door. In the days that followed, Harrows Creek changed in ways that were harder to explain. Livestock were found dead in their pens, untouched by predators, but with their eyes gone. Candles left burning overnight were discovered in the morning, melted to nubs, though no one had lit them. A thin layer of frost began forming inside certain homes, clinging to mirrors and windows from within. The effigies multiplied. Children found them in the schoolyard. Farmers discovered them hanging from fence posts. Each was more detailed than the last, the straw mixed now with hair, cloth, even bits of bone, and the names changed. Not just Clara Ridgeway anymore. There were other names, all belonging to people still alive in town. McCall began keeping watch on the Ridgeway property from a distance, but it proved useless. Clara no longer wandered the orchard. In fact, she seemed to be seen less and less by anyone, as if she were fading from daily life. Yet whenever someone did glimpse her, she was always looking toward the marsh. On the night of January 22nd, a new set of barefoot tracks appeared in the snow, leading from the marsh mound straight to the back of the Ridgeway house. They were deeper than before, as if whatever made them carried a great weight. They stopped at the cellar door, which, by morning, was found slightly ajar. Inside the cellar, McCall found something that tightened his throat. Hanging from the rafters were 3 effigies, each bearing the face of someone in town, faces painted crudely but unmistakable. The one in the center or the sheriff's own likeness. He took them down and burned them immediately, though he could not shake the feeling that such an act was less destruction and more provocation. That evening, the wind carried a sound. Over the fields, not the howl of a storm, but something slower, rhythmic, like breath. And beneath it, the faint rustle of straw dot. It was then McCall realized something he had been trying not to think since the day. Clara had stepped into her own funeral. The girl who had returned might not have been saved from death. She might have been something death sent back. The days that followed were restless ones, thick with an unease that seemed to cling to every wall, every breath of wind. Harrows Creek was no stranger to hardship. Bad harvests, sickness, and storms had all come and gone before. But this was different. This felt like the kind of danger you couldn't lock a door against. By now, the townsfolk had stopped speaking Clara's name openly. She was the girl, her, or simply that thing. The Ridgeway home had become a place people crossed the street to avoid, even in daylight. And though Mrs. Ridgeway still made occasional appearances in town, pale, gaunt, but polite, Clara herself was seen only in fleeting glimpses, as if she were now more rumor than flesh. Sheriff McCall found himself waking in the small hours of the night, unable to shake the sensation of being watched. Twice he thought he saw movement outside his own home, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the lamplight, still as the fence posts. When he went to investigate, the snow was unmarked. Then came the night of January 29th. A scream tore through the quiet, sharp, short, and cut off too soon. It came from the direction of the mill, and by the time McCall reached the scene, half-dozen others had gathered. There, just inside the mill's frozen doorway, lay the body of Matthew Cole, the miller's apprentice. His head rested at an unnatural angle, and his eyes were gone. But it wasn't just the violence. That chilled McCall. In Matthew's hand, clutched so tightly the sheriff had to pry it free, was a bundle of straw bound with sinew. Its shape was unmistakable, a miniature effigy. Across its chest was a strip of linen, smeared with something dark, bearing the name Matthew Cole in the same faded hand as the others. Tracks in the snow led away from the mill, barefoot again, but this time there were two sets, one smaller, lighter, and the other heavier, pressing deeper into the crust. They led toward the marsh. McCall followed them alone. The townsfolk were unwilling, muttering that the marsh was a place of no return after nightfall. The air grew colder as he approached, and the snow took on a strange crust, glittering faintly in the moonlight. The mound lay ahead, the stakes still jutting from it like ribs, but it wasn't as it had been before. Someone or something had dug deeper. The earth was turned up in a rough oval, the sides lined with straw and reeds. In the center lay not an effigy this time, but a body. McCall's breath caught when he saw the face. It was Clara. Pale, still, eyes closed. Her skin looked waxen, almost too smooth. She wore the same dress she'd been buried in the first time, dirt clinging to the hem. McCall's mind reeled. He'd seen her alive just days ago, standing in the Ridgeway yard. And yet here she was, lying in the earth, like she'd never left it. A sound broke the stillness, the faint crunch of snow behind him. McCall turned, expecting to see one of the braver townsfolk who had followed despite their fear. It wasn't. Standing at the edge of the mound was Clara, alive, awake. Her hair hung in wet strands, as though she had just climbed out of water, though the marsh was frozen solid. She didn't blink, didn't speak. She only tilted her head in that strange, assessing way, her eyes catching the moonlight with that same glassy gleam. McCall looked back at the body in the mound, then at the girl. Before him, his mind refusing to bridge the distance between the two. He took a step back, and that was when he noticed something worse. The bare footprints leading from the mound were not Clara's at all. They were larger, and they were standing directly behind him. He turned, but the cold hit him first. a breath on the back of his neck, damp and smelling faintly of soil. His lantern flickered, and in that momentary dimness, the rustle of straw swelled, filling his ears until it was all he could hear. When the light steadied again, there was nothing there, only the two sets of prints, and a shallow drag in the snow, as though something heavy had been pulled toward the trees. McCall left the marsh that night without disturbing the body in the mound. He didn't sleep. He couldn't, because the image that kept returning to him was not the impossibility of two Claras, nor the larger prints in the snow. It was the face of the Clara in the mound. Her mouth was curled, ever so slightly, into a smile. By morning, McCall's resolve was brittle as glass. He had told no one what he'd seen at the marsh. Not the duplicate Clara, not the second set of prints, not the way the corpse's mouth seemed to curl as though in on some private joke. Some truths, he decided, had a way of shattering a man faster than any lie. Still, the town was restless. Matthew Cole's funeral drew a crowd, though most stayed huddled in the back, their eyes flicking toward the door as if expecting it to burst open. Clara didn't attend, neither the living one nor the one McCall had left lying in the mound. And yet, a handful of people swore they saw her standing among the gravestones after dark, her hands clasped behind her back, head bowed, as though studying each name with quiet interest. The sheriff tried to turn his focus to the tangible, to the deaths, the effigies, the tracks. But even the tangible seemed to twist beneath his touch. A farmer brought him a strange object found at the edge of his property, an effigy made not of straw, but of tightly woven human hair. Another man claimed his barn door had been nailed shut from the inside, and when he pried it open, he found the interior coated in a thin layer of ice, as though winter had taken root inside the wood itself. The effigies were no longer bound to names of the living. Some bore dates. Others, scraps of paper with symbols no one recognized, circles intersected with lines, jagged shapes like crooked letters. The number 13 recurred often, scratched or stitched into the straw. And then there was the disappearance. On February 2nd, Mrs. Ridgeway failed to appear for her weekly provisions. Her absence wasn't unusual at first, but by evening, neighbors noticed the Ridgeway home was entirely dark. No lanterns in the windows, no smoke from the chimney. McCall arrived to find the front door unlocked. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of damp earth. The parlor was untouched, but the kitchen showed signs of haste. A chair tipped over, a pot still warm on the stove, though the contents had gone cold. In the hall, muddy footprints, bare, long, deep, led toward the cellar door. The sheriff descended into the cellar cautiously. The light from his lantern revealed an emptiness that felt too deliberate, as though things had been cleared away to make space. The 3 rafters where he'd once found the effigies were now bare, but the hooks were still there, swaying slightly in a draught. On the packed dirt floor lay only one thing, a child's dress folded neatly, the hem soaked through. It was Clara's. McCall came back up. The house seemed quieter than before. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of being watched. He left without searching further, certain he'd find nothing Mrs. Ridgeway would want him to see. That night, the 1st, snow and days began to fall, light and dry, settling across the fields like sifted ash. By dawn, the Ridgeway home had a new adornment. 13 effigies staked in a perfect circle around it, each facing inward toward the house. McCall approached them warily. They were taller now, chest high, and their faces were no longer blank. Each one bore the crudely shaped features of someone from Harrows Creek. And in the circle's center, at the very front of the Ridgeway home, stood one effigy unlike the rest. It had no face at all, but in its chest cavity hung a small scrap of linen with the name Elias McCall written across it in faded ink. That night. The dreams began. The sheriff saw himself standing in the marsh, the stakes surrounding him instead of the mound. The earth beneath his boots was soft, too soft, and when he looked down, he saw that it was breathing. From the ground rose shapes. Not effigies, not people, but something between, their limbs jointed wrong, their heads too heavy for their necks. In the dream, he couldn't run, couldn't move, could only watch as one of them lifted its head to show a mouth full of straw. Whispering his name in a voice that was not human. He woke with a start, sweat freezing on his skin despite the fire in the stove. At the window, he thought he saw Clara, or something like her, walking toward the tree line, her dress trailing damp earth. In her hand, she carried one of the effigies, its straw arms swaying like a pendulum. McCall didn't follow. Not that night. But he knew the circle was closing, and the number 13 was counting down. The morning after that dream, the sheriff found Harrows Creek quieter than he had ever known it. Shops were shuttered, doors barred. Smoke curled from chimneys, but no one lingered outside to speak. It was as if the town itself had gone into hiding. Word spread quickly, even without tongues willing to speak it aloud. Another disappearance. Thomas Granger, the blacksmith's son. He'd been seen the previous evening helping his father lock up the forge. By sunrise, both he and his footprints had vanished. No sign of a struggle, no trail leading away, but there was something. On the anvil in the forge lay a single object, a hammer whose head was wrapped tightly in strips of cloth. Beneath the binding, when McCall cut it away, was the same pattern of intersecting circles and jagged shapes that had appeared on the newer effigies. The metal was ice-cold, far colder than the air, and left a faint rim of frost wherever it touched. Thoughts kept returning to the number 13. The effigies around the Ridgeway home, each bearing the likeness of a townsfolk, had not changed position, but something about them seemed more complete. Their straw was darker now, slick in places as if damp, and the names stitched. Into their linen scraps had faded, replaced by the carved symbols. McCall began to suspect the effigies weren't warnings. They were preparations. That night, the wind shifted, bringing with it the smell of rotting vegetation from the marsh, though the ground was still locked in frost. He tried to ignore it, but the scent seeped into every room of his house. Just after midnight, the knocking began. 3 slow raps on the front door. Then silence. When he opened it, the porch was empty. But at the top step lay an effigy, smaller than the others, barely the height of his knee. Its head was wrapped in black cloth, its limbs bound with twine, so tight they cut into the straw. McCall stooped to pick it up, but as soon as he touched, something inside shifted, as though the effigy's chest held not straw, but something heavier. He cut the twine and pulled the bundle apart. Inside was a human tooth. It was cracked and yellowed, but the root was still wet. The next day brought the first open act of defiance from the townsfolk. A group of men, led by the mill owner, marched to the Ridgeway property with torches in hand, intent on burning the effigies. McCall, knowing the futility of it, but unable to dissuade them, followed. The fire caught quickly, smoke billowing upward into the cold sky. The effigies blackened, twisted, and collapsed. The men cheered at first, but then the smoke changed. It thickened, took on an oily sheen, and the smell, it wasn't wood or straw anymore. It was hair. And through the smoke came a sound. Faint but distinct. Laughter, not from the Ridgeway house. From beneath the ground, the men scattered, their courage burned away faster than the straw. McCall stood alone amid the ashes. He couldn't prove it, but he swore the ground beneath the effigies seemed warmer, almost soft under his boots, like the crust of snow was hiding something alive. That night, another dream came. He saw 13. Figures standing at the edge of the marsh, each holding something small in their hands. Teeth, bones, scraps of cloth. They stood in silence until one by one they stepped into the water, disappearing beneath without a ripple. And standing behind them was Clara. Not the pale, fragile girl from before, but something taller, her spine too straight, her head tilted back as though smelling the air. Her eyes glowed faintly, catching the moonlight like a cat's. In the dream, she lifted her hand and pointed directly at him. When he woke, he could still smell the marsh water. And on his knitstand, where no one could have placed it without, waking him, lay another effigy, this one smaller still, no more than a child's toy dot. It bore no name, only the number 11 carved deep into its chest. McCall didn't sleep the next night. He sat in his chair with the fire burning low, his revolver laid across his knees, watching the shadows shift along the walls. Outside, the wind scraped dry branches against the siding like fingernails. Every so often, he'd hear the faintest sound from the porch, the creak of a loose board, the crunch of snow under a weight too light to be a man's dot by dawn. His eyes burned from strain, but the night had passed without intrusion. Or so he thought. When he stepped outside, he saw them. 2 new effigies. Not staked in the yard this time, but leaning against his doorframe like guests waiting to be invited in. They were different from the others, made entirely of twisted roots, the bark stripped away in places to reveal a pale, sinewy surface beneath. Their heads were bent toward each other, as though whispering. On the chest of one, the number 10 was carved. On the other, 9, the sheriff carried them to the marsh and set them ablaze himself. But as the roots burned, they released a smell that made his stomach churn, not wood, but something closer to meat, seared and charred. He stayed until nothing remained but a heap of brittle ash dot. By the time he returned to town, Harrows Creek was in open panic. A 3rd disappearance overnight. Agnes Delaney, the schoolteacher, gone from her bed without a sound. Her door had been bolted from the inside, her windows nailed shut. Yet she was gone, and in her place, on her pillow, lay a small pile of teeth. Not human, but not animal either. People began to whisper about leaving, but no one did. The roads out of town were frozen hard, and the snow drifts in the hills would make travel near impossible. It wasn't just the weather that kept them, though. It was something else, a feeling McCall had noticed growing stronger each day. The further one walked toward the edge of town, the heavier the air felt, like wading into a deep current. By the time you reached the tree line, the pressure in your chest became almost unbearable. No one went farther. That night, McCall patrolled the streets, hoping to catch whoever or whatever was responsible. The snow was fresh, perfect for tracking, but the only prints he found were his own. Even so, he could feel the presence moving with him, never ahead, never behind, always beside him in the corner of his vision. Got around midnight. He saw her dot Clara, standing in the mouth of an alley, her dress dripping as though she'd stepped from a river. Her eyes were fixed on him, unblinking, her face expressionless. In her hands she held something long and narrow, wrapped in cloth. Without a word, she turned and walked into the darkness. McCall followed. The alley twisted behind the backs of buildings, narrowing until it was barely wide enough for a man to pass. The ground here was wet. The snow melted away to reveal dark, slick earth. Ahead, Clara moved with an unnatural grace, her feet making no sound. At the end of the alley, she stopped beside a wooden door set into the ground, a storm cellar, though he'd never seen one in this part of town. She placed the wrapped object on the ground, then knelt and began to scratch something into the wood of the door. When McCall stepped closer, she turned her head toward him, not all the way, but enough for him to see that her mouth was moving. She was whispering. The words weren't in any language he knew, but they made the hair on his arms stand on end. And as she spoke, the wood beneath her fingers began to blacken. The grain twisting like rope. McCall called out to her, his voice low but firm. Clara didn't answer. She rose slowly, picked up the wrapped object, and without looking at him, descended the steps into the darkness below. The door swung shut behind her with a sound that was almost gentle. When the sheriff reached it, the door wouldn't budge. He pulled, kicked, even braced his shoulder against it, but it was as if the earth itself held it closed. He stepped back, breathing hard, and that's when he saw it, carved into the wood where Clara had been scratching, the number 8. By the morning after Clara vanished into that cellar, the town's silence felt absolute, as though Harrows Creek had stopped breathing. No hammers rang from the blacksmiths, no wagon wheels creaked, no children's laughter drifted in from the schoolyard. Every face McCall passed was pale, drawn, eyes darting to the woods or the marsh, as if waiting for something to emerge. 8. That was the number now. McCall knew what it meant. 8 still to be taken. 8 effigies yet to be replaced by flesh. The sheriff returned to the alley in daylight, determined to find that cellar. But when he reached the end, the wall of buildings was unbroken. No door, no steps, no scar in the earth where one had been. Only bare, frozen ground, pocked with deep impressions, as if something had stood there for years and had only just been lifted away. He followed the impressions through the narrow, back lanes until they ended at the old Ridgeway barn. The roof sagged, its walls gaping, but the ground inside was strangely undisturbed. No snow had settled here, though the rafters above were wide open to the winter sky. In the center of the dirt floor sat a circle of stones. They hadn't been there before. McCall was sure of it. Each stone was carved with the same intersecting symbols he'd seen on the effigies, the lines filled with something dark and sticky. Inside the circle lay the remains of the root effigies. He'd burned, except now they were whole again. Whole and different. Their straw had been replaced with something fibrous and gray, their button eyes gone, their heads tilted upward as though listening. McCall stepped into the circle. The air thickened at once, heavy and damp, carrying that same marsh smell from the night of the laughter. He bent to examine one of the effigies, and that's when its chest shifted. Not like straw settling, like breathing. A voice slid into his ear, not from the effigy, not from anywhere he could place, but inside him. It was Clara's voice, soft and level. They'll come for the rest. You can't stop them. You were never meant to. McCall stumbled backward, his boot catching on one of the stones. When he hit the ground, the barn seemed to change. The daylight dimming, the wood around him swelling and groaning. Through the gaps in the walls, he saw shapes moving in the snow, tall, thin, and wrong in their proportions, their heads bending. At sharp angles, their limbs jointed like an insect's. They came closer, their feet leaving no prints. One by one, they stepped into the barn. Each carried something small, a tooth, a lock of hair, a finger bone. The effigies within the circle began to writhe, their limbs stretching, their heads twisting toward the newcomers. McCall tried to raise his gun, but his arm felt leaden. His breath came short. A pressure grew behind his eyes until tears spilled down his cheeks, not from fear, but from the unnatural weight of the air. Clara appeared among them, her dress still wet, her eyes gleaming faintly. She walked to the center of the circle and knelt, placing a bundle wrapped in black cloth on the ground. The shapes gathered around her, and the effigies reached for them with eager, grasping hands. One of the shapes turned its head toward McCall. It had no face, but the suggestion of a mouth stretched impossibly wide. The sheriff's vision blurred. The barn spun, and just before darkness took him, he saw the effigy at his feet. Its chest bore a fresh carving, The number 7 dot. He awoke in his own bed at dawn. The fire long dead, the room colder than the air outside. On the knit-stand, where he'd left nothing, sat a single-root effigy, smaller than the rest, no name, no symbol. Just a blank waiting surface dot, and for the first time, Sheriff McCall understood that it wasn't a countdown to 0 dot. It was a countdown to him.